I never thought I'd be humiliated in front of 200 people by the woman I once believed was my entire future. My name is Daniel, and this is not just another sad breakup story. This is about how the love of my life turned me into the punchline of her wedding, and how her father's greed came back to destroy them both. I met Emily Carter during my sophomore year of college in Chicago. She had that kind of presence that made rooms bend toward her. Blonde hair, blue eyes, and a laugh that was just loud enough to make people turn their heads, but never too much. She was magnetic, and me. I wasn't the guy people noticed first. At 6'1" and almost 300 pounds, I was the big guy who tried to stay out of the spotlight. But Emily noticed me. She made me believe I was more than the shadows I hid in. We started dating, and for the first time in my life, I thought I had won. She didn't seem to care about my size or my quiet nature. She called me sweet, dependable, someone she could see a future with. And I wanted nothing more than to give her that future. But people change when money and status get involved. Fast forward 6 years. Emily had climbed her way into Chicago's corporate social circles, thanks mostly to her father, Richard Carter, who owned a mid-sized manufacturing company. The Carters weren't billionaires, but they moved in rich circles, cocktail parties, charity events, golf clubs where deals were sealed with a handshake and a whiskey. Emily fit right in. Me? I was always the odd one out, the guy they politely smiled at, but never really acknowledged. Still, I loved her. I thought that was enough. I'll never forget the night she told me about Ryan Harrison. Tall, lean, Ivy League graduate with a family trust fund that could buy and sell entire neighborhoods in Chicago. He came from the kind of money that makes people forget their morals. And apparently, he came for Emily. She confessed in our apartment, her voice almost apologetic, but her eyes glowing with excitement. Dan, I just don't see this working anymore. You're comfortable. Too comfortable. Ryan is ambitious. He knows people. Important people. You don't get it. I remember sitting there, feeling the weight of her words crash over me like waves. It wasn't that she didn't love me anymore. It was that she thought I wasn't good enough. Too big. Too quiet. Too me. 2 months later, she was engaged to Ryan. I could have disappeared. Most guys would have. But part of me needed to see her one last time. Needed closure. Needed proof that I wasn't just some stepping stone she had used to reach higher ground. So when I got the wedding invitation, yes, she sent me an invitation, I decided to go. Maybe it was masochism, maybe pride, but I went. The venue was everything you'd expect from a Chicago high society wedding. Crystal chandeliers, gold-trimmed dinnerware, waiters in white gloves serving champagne that cost more per bottle than I made in a week. Everyone was dressed to impress, and I was no exception. I had spent weeks preparing, dropped nearly 20 pounds, bought a tailored black suit that actually fit me, and walked into that ballroom, determined not to look like the pathetic ex. And then it happened. During the reception, after the first dance, Emily spotted me. She walked right up with that same smile she used to give me, only now it carried poison. Her friends were gathered around her, giggling, whispering like a pack of vultures. "Daniel," she said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "You actually came. Oh my God, you look exactly the same. Honestly, I'm impressed the floor hasn't caved in under you yet." The laughter hit like a slap. But she wasn't finished. She leaned closer, her voice dripping with venom, and said words that I'll never forget. "You know what you always reminded me of, Dan? A fat pig. And now, standing here at my wedding, I finally get why. You were never going to be enough." For a second, the room spun. I felt the heat rise in my face, my fists clench at my sides. Every instinct told me to walk away, to hide, to let the humiliation swallow me whole. But then I saw her father across the room, Richard Carter, smirking. like he had just watched his daughter put me back in my place. What neither of them knew was that the man standing next to Richard, the tall, well-dressed stranger with silver hair and an easy smile, was me, or at least the man I had become in the months since Emily left. Because while Emily and Ryan were busy planning their picture-perfect wedding, I had been building something else entirely. And the man Richard Carter was shaking hands with that night was the mystery millionaire who had just bought out his entire company. Emily thought she had married into wealth and power. What she didn't realize was that she had just insulted the man who now owned her father's legacy. And that was only the beginning. The moment Emily's words echoed across that glittering ballroom, I felt something inside me harden. The laughter, the whispers, the pitying looks. They all blurred into a low hum in the background. I should have left, but I didn't. I stood tall, straightened my jacket, and smiled. Not at Emily, not at Ryan, but at her father. Because Richard Carter had no idea that I wasn't just the ex-boyfriend he despised. I was the man who now controlled the company that kept his family's wealth afloat. You see, I wasn't always the quiet, overweight guy who let life push him around. After Emily left, something in me snapped. At first, I drowned myself in work, taking on longer shifts and endless projects. But soon, I realized that if I wanted real power, the kind that made men like Richard Carter shake my hand, I had to step out of the shadows. I started small. A few years back, I had invested in tech startups, mostly because I was obsessed with gadgets and had some savings I didn't mind risking. One of those investments exploded, an AI logistics company that got acquired by Amazon for a sum I couldn't have even dreamed of. Overnight, I went from paycheck to having millions in the bank, but I didn't stop there. I hired a financial advisor, learned everything I could about stocks, real estate, and acquisitions. I played it smart, never loud, while Emily was busy flaunting her new fiancé on Instagram. I was building a portfolio that quietly put me in the same league as the men her father admired. So when I learned that Carter Industries was struggling, hemorrhaging cash, after a series of bad contracts, made my move. Through a shell company, I bought majority shares. The deal closed just 2 weeks before the wedding. Richard Carter had no idea who the real buyer was. To him, it was just another faceless investor with deep pockets. Now, standing there at his daughter's wedding, I had all the leverage in the world. Emily's insults stung, sure, but I wasn't there to win her back or prove her wrong. I was there to watch everything she thought was secure crumble in her perfectly manicured hands. "Daniel!" A voice called from across the room. It was Richard himself, waving me over with a big, forced smile. He had no clue. "Come meet Mr. Hayes, our newest partner." Partner. The word made me almost laugh. Richard was clueless. I walked over, every eye in the room still on me after Emily's little performance. My heart was pounding, but not from embarrassment anymore, from anticipation, from the satisfaction of knowing that this was the first step in something much bigger. "Richard," I said smoothly, extending my hand. "Congratulations on the wedding." He gripped it firmly, his eyes sharp, searching. "Daniel, right? Emily's old friend." The pause told me everything. To him, I wasn't worth remembering. "Yes," I said, glancing at Emily, who was clutching Ryan's arm, still smirking. "Old friend, but I think we're about to be working much closer than you realize." Richard frowned, confused, but Mr. Hayes quickly covered. "Richard, Daniel here is one of our lead investors. Without him, this deal wouldn't have been possible." Emily's face dropped. Ryan's smile faltered. For the first time that night, the power shifted. "Investor," Richard repeated, his voice stiff. I didn't answer. Not yet. I just smiled politely, let the silence hang, and excused myself to the bar. Sometimes, silence is the sharpest blade. As I sipped my drink, I felt Emily's eyes burning into me. She wanted to believe it was some coincidence, some fluke. But she knew me better than that. She knew I didn't walk into places without a reason. Later that evening, as the music drowned out the chatter, Emily found me outside on the terrace. The city lights of Chicago flickered behind her, but her eyes were darker than I'd ever seen. "What the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice low enough so no one else could hear. I tilted my glass. "Celebrating your big day. Isn't that what you wanted?" "Cut the crap, Daniel. Why did Hayes say you're an investor?" I shrugged. "Because I am. In fact, I own more of Carter Industries than your father does now." "Congratulations! You just married into a sinking ship." Her face went pale. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For once, Emily Carter, queen of clever comebacks, was speechless. "Enjoy your honeymoon," I said, brushing past her. "Because when you get back, your whole world will look very different." Walking away from her felt like redemption, not the kind that comes from forgiveness, but the kind born from finally holding the cards no one thought you'd ever have. But my revenge wasn't complete. Not yet. Richard Carter was about to learn what happens when you underestimate a man you once dismissed as a fat pig. And Emily? She was going to learn that the future she thought she secured was built on quicksand. As I drove home that night, the Chicago skyline glowing in my rearview mirror, I made myself a promise. I wasn't just going to take back my dignity. I was going to take everything, and I had the power to do it. The Monday after the wedding, I made my first move. Richard Carter probably woke up that morning in his suburban mansion, thinking he still owned the world. Maybe he even bragged over breakfast to Emily and Ryan about how the company was back on track, how Hayes had brought in a miracle investor. But by noon, his fantasy would be over, because that was the day I called the first board meeting. When Richard walked into the conference room of Carter Industries, his usual swagger was in full display. Expensive tailored suit, Rolex flashing every time he adjusted his cuff. A smirk that said he believed everyone in the room owed him something. But then he saw me at the head of the table. The look on his face was priceless. "Daniel," he said, his voice sharp, like he had just swallowed glass. "What are you doing here?" I leaned back in the chair, fingers steepled. "Good morning, Richard. I'm here because, as of 2 weeks ago, I'm the majority shareholder, which means I get to call this meeting." The silence that followed was heavy. The other board members shifted in their seats, some pretending to read their papers, others staring at me like they'd just seen a ghost. Richard's jaw clenched. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," I replied calmly. "You see, while you were busy hosting golf tournaments and throwing money at parties, your company was bleeding, and I was the one smart enough to buy it out before someone else did." His face flushed crimson. For the first time, Richard Carter, the man who had built his life on control and intimidation, looked powerless. "This is a family company," he snapped. "You don't know how things work here." I leaned forward, my voice steady, cutting through the tension. "Correction, this was a family company. Now it's mine. And things are going to change." I laid out my first set of orders: restructuring, downsizing bloated departments, cancelling a few of Richard's vanity projects that had cost the company millions. Every word I spoke chipped away at his pride. By the time the meeting ended, Richard looked like he had aged 10 years in a single hour. But I wasn't finished. That evening, as I left the office, I saw Emily waiting for me by my car. Her hair was pulled back, her makeup flawless, but her eyes betrayed her panic. She wasn't here to flirt or mock me. She was here because she was scared. "Daniel, please," she started, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "You don't have to do this. My dad, he's under a lot of pressure. If you could just work with us, we can find a way to make this beneficial for everyone." I almost laughed. This was the same woman who had called me a fat pig in front of her entire wedding. Now she wanted to negotiate. "Emily," I said quietly, "this isn't about business. This is about respect. Something your family never gave me. Something you never gave me." Her lips trembled. "I was wrong, okay? I said things I shouldn't have." "No." I cut her off. "You said exactly what you wanted to say, and now you get to watch the consequences." I opened my car door and left her standing there in the parking lot, her perfect facade cracking under the weight of reality. Over the next few weeks, I tightened the screws. Vendors who had been giving Carter Industries favorable contracts suddenly stopped. Banks that had extended generous credit lines began to pull back. All it took was a few calls, a few nudges in the right direction. I had friends in finance now, powerful friends, and they owed me favors. Richard's empire was shrinking, and every day he looked more desperate. Meanwhile, Ryan Harrison was starting to sweat. He had married Emily, expecting a golden ticket into wealth and connections. But now, instead of cozy dinners with Chicago's elite, he was sitting across from a father-in-law whose company was crumbling. The Harrison family wasn't thrilled either. They didn't like seeing their golden boy tied to a sinking ship. One evening, Ryan stormed into my office uninvited. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he hissed. "Destroying her father's company just to get back at Emily. Pathetic." I stayed calm, sipping my coffee. This isn't about Emily. This is about teaching people that arrogance has consequences. He slammed his hand on my desk. "You'll regret this," I smiled, leaning back in my chair. "Funny. That's exactly what your wife said to me once. But so far, I'm the only one who seems to be winning." Ryan stormed out, slamming the door behind him. His threats didn't scare me. They only fueled me. But deep down, I knew this was more than revenge now. It wasn't just about Emily's insult at the wedding, or Richard's years of dismissing me. It was about rewriting the story of my life. No longer the fat pig in the shadows. No longer the man everyone underestimated. I was in control now, and I wasn't going to stop until the Carters had nothing left. Still, there was one thing I hadn't accounted for: the human heart. Because as much as I wanted to believe this was purely business, there was a part of me, small but persistent, that still remembered Emily's laughter back in college. The way she once looked at me, like I was the only man in the world. That memory was a poison, lingering in the back of my mind, and it was about to complicate everything. Richard Carter was a man who had built his life on dominance. He wasn't the type to roll over and accept defeat, especially not from someone like me, a man he had spent years mocking behind closed doors. I knew he wouldn't go quietly, and I was right. 2 weeks after that explosive board meeting, Richard called for an emergency shareholders session. His goal was clear: rally what little influence he had left and try to push me out. But influence means nothing when money isn't on your side. I arrived at the Carter Industries headquarters early, dressed in a tailored navy suit that fit better than anything I had ever worn in my life. I wanted Richard to see not just the man he underestimated, but the man who had already replaced him. When the meeting started, Richard launched into a passionate speech. His voice boomed, his face red with fury as he painted me as an outsider, a predator who wanted to strip the company of its soul. "He doesn't care about Carter Industries," Richard shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "He's here for revenge, for some personal vendetta. You can't let him destroy everything we've built." The irony wasn't lost on me. Everything he had built, without my money, without my moves, Carter Industries would already be in bankruptcy court. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't shout. I didn't need to. I simply laid out the numbers. Balance sheets, cash flow statements, graphs that showed exactly how close this company had been to collapse before I stepped in. And then I delivered the final blow. "Gentlemen, the truth is simple. Richard Carter no longer owns Carter Industries. I do, and I've saved it from bankruptcy. If Richard believes this is personal, he's right. It is personal, because I don't believe in letting incompetence dictate the future of this company. I believe in results. The board voted overwhelmingly in my favor. Richard lost every ounce of power he had left. He was a figurehead now, stripped of authority, a lion with no teeth. That night, I expected silence from the Carters. Instead, I got a phone call. Emily. Her voice was shaky, unsteady, nothing like the confident woman who had cut me down at her wedding. Daniel, can we meet? Please, just talk. I should have said no. I should have hung up the phone. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and part of me wanted to see her squirm. We met at a quiet bar on the north side of Chicago. She walked in wearing a beige coat over a black dress, her hair pinned neatly like she had tried to control every strand. But her eyes gave her away. They were tired, frightened. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, sliding into the booth across from me. I didn't bother with small talk. "What do you want, Emily?" Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around her glass. "I know you hate me. I know I hurt you. But you're destroying my family. My father. He's not perfect. But this company is his life. And Ryan," I laughed bitterly. "Ryan? The guy who married you for your last name. The guy who hasn't worked a real day in his life." She flinched but didn't argue. "I'm asking you to stop. Please. Whatever you're trying to prove, you've already done it. You've shown us all you're not the man we thought you were." For a moment, I almost believed her. For a moment, I saw the Emily I once loved. The college girl who used to sit with me in the library and sketch out plans for the future. But then I remembered the wedding, the laughter, the word pig still burning in my ears. "You think this is about proving myself?" I leaned closer, my voice low, controlled. "This is about teaching you and your father a lesson. Actions have consequences. Words have consequences. You can't humiliate someone and expect them to stay down forever." Her eyes filled with tears. "Daniel, I made a mistake. A terrible one. But if you keep doing this, you'll become someone worse than my father. Is that what you want?" For the first time in weeks, I hesitated. Her words dug at me in ways I didn't expect. Because deep down, I wasn't sure anymore if this was justice or obsession. I stood up, throwing cash on the table for the drinks. "I'll think about what you said, but don't expect mercy, Emily. Not now." As I walked out of the bar, I knew she would run straight to her father and Ryan. They would plan their next move, try to fight me harder. But that was fine, because I was ready for them. The next morning, I set my plan into motion. If Richard wanted to play dirty, I could play dirtier. I began leaking whispers into the market, rumors about Carter Industries' instability, subtle enough not to tank the stock immediately, but steady enough to make investors nervous. Within days, the company's value dipped. Reporters began asking questions. Employees whispered about layoffs, and Richard Carter watched helplessly as the empire he had built slowly unraveled. But what I didn't know was that Richard wasn't finished yet. He had one last card to play, and it was going to hit closer to home than I ever imagined. For a week, the air around Carter Industries tasted like burnt coffee and panic. The boardroom meetings were tense, the hallways full of hushed conversations. Share prices wavered. Clients asked for reassurances they didn't get. Richard paced like a caged animal, and I watched him through meetings and phone calls, cataloging the small changes, how he blinked too fast, how his hands trembled when he held a pen. Pride does that to men. It makes them fragile. Then Richard played his last card. It wasn't a boardroom move or a public smear. It was quieter, meaner, and aimed at vulnerability. He hired a private investigator. A name from the darker corner of my past was pulled out, dusted off, and handed to him like a weapon. The PI dug where I had thought long buried. Old debts, An ugly college arrest I'd paid to seal. A reckless year when I'd disappeared for months, and people assumed the worst. None of it was criminal, but when placed together and served on a polished platter at the right time, it could look like a pattern. A loser trying to buy his way into relevance. The call came late on a Friday. My lawyer's voice was slow and flat over the phone, like someone repeating bad news because it deserved time to land. "We have a problem," he said. "There's chatter. Anonymous calls to investors. A dossier. They're using your past to paint you as a hostile takeover artist. A man with questionable motives. They want the board to force you out." I felt the floor tilt, not because of the dossier's content. That was manageable. But because Richard had found a lever that wasn't financial. He'd attacked my story, the clean reinvention I had worked so hard to build. He was trying to make me a fiction, a cautionary footnote in other people's conversation. I should have expected it. Men like Richard don't go down quietly. They claw. They hurt people in places that sting the most. For him, it was my reputation. For him, it was about control. And he was about to remind everyone why that mattered. I called Emily. I hadn't meant to. I told myself it was a business call. Damage control. Reassurance. When she answered, I could hear fear threaded through her. Hello. But also a firmness. One she wore like armor. "Daniel, what happened?" she asked. "Is it true? People are talking." "Doesn't matter," I said. "It matters that it's coming from your father." There was a long silence, like the air itself was weighing whether to break. "I didn't know he'd go that far," Emily whispered. "Then he thinks if he ruins you, it proves something to him. But he's only making things worse. People are scared, Daniel. Ryan's family is whispering about calls to the board. They want a clean break." "Then tell them what you know," I said. "Tell everyone I bought the company because I wanted to save it. Tell them I have the receipts, the audits. Expose the truth about the contracts. Don't let his lies stick." She was quiet. That's when the other blow landed. Not Richard's doing, but Ryan's. The night after the dossier surfaced, a well-placed reporter called every major finance desk in Chicago. Ryan had made a choice. He went on record, distancing himself from me in the most public way possible, calling my takeover a hostile move that destabilized an already fragile company. He used language designed to appeal to shareholders' fear, to embarrass me. He painted me as a vengeful outsider. He offered no proof. He didn't need to. Rumor and fear travel faster than facts. I remember the moment the article hit. Ryan's quoted line in ink and pixels. And something inside me unclenched, not with relief, but with a sick recognition. I had pushed too hard. In the stretches where I told myself I was exacting justice, I had also become a spectacle. A man capable of buying a company can be both a hero and a villain in the same breath, depending on who controls the microphone. That night, I sat alone in my office. The city lights like distant stars, smeared with a thin layer of fog. I went through the legal files, the audits, pulling evidence together. Facts don't blush. They don't apologize. They just stand. I planned a counterstrike, release the contracts, disclose the audits, hold a public press conference. I would present the truth and drown the lies in paper and law. It should have been simple. But Richard had more than one trick. He'd slid quietly into the office of a board member who still retained loyalty to his family and whispered of scandals worse than my college misstep, rumors of mismanagement, of secret agreements, of emails that would show me in a poor light. The board split. Half backed me because my money saved their jobs. Half feared the liability and the optics, and wanted to avoid any further blood on the carpet. Then came the thing I hadn't anticipated. My mother's name in a leak. I grew up in a small house on the south side. My mother worked 2 jobs to keep our lights on. She taught me to hold my head up, to measure a man by how he treated others behind closed doors. Richard targeted her because he knew it would hurt me in a way financial ruin never could. A website surfaced with doctored photos and text that suggested my mother had been involved in a property dispute. It was meaningless, petty, and cruel, but the news feeds ate it up. When I called her, she answered like she always did, steady, practical. "Are you okay?" she asked, the way mothers do, before they allow their worry to take form. "Not yet," I said. "But I will be." She didn't need to hear the full story. She had enough to worry about without the details. But the call gave me perspective. I had started this war with the intention of breaking pride, not to cause collateral damage. Watching my mother's name dragged through the mud snapped something back into place for me. I decided then that the next move wouldn't be about humiliation. It would be surgical. It would be about exposing truth, not orchestrating round-the-clock public shame. I scheduled the press conference for Friday morning. I had my attorney, 2 forensic accountants, and a stack of documents that would make the dossier look like amateur hour. I planned to walk through the numbers, show the mismanagement, and highlight the suppliers who had cut credit lines because Richard's side deals had siphoned funds. I would make clear that my intention from day one was to stabilize and save the company, not to dismantle it. On Thursday night, Emily came to my building. She looked exhausted. Her makeup was smudged, like she had versions of herself that had been through the wash and come out frayed. "I can't do this anymore, Daniel," she said, her voice small. "Seeing my father like this, seeing my husband, Ryan, acting like he's the moral compass when he signed deals without reading them. I don't know what I believe anymore." "You think I do?" I asked. "I don't sleep, Emily. I don't eat. I watch the news. I hear my mother's name in a headline, and my stomach flips. This isn't a game. It's not a script." "I know," she murmured. "But what if winning makes you someone else? What if you become the monster you think you're fighting?" Her question stung because it was true. I had to admit that somewhere along the line, the lines blurred. The chorus of my old shame, the jokes, the looks, the whispered fat pig, had powered me. But that fuel could run out or it could consume me. Friday morning, the room filled with reporters. Cameras pointed like a dozen cold eyes. Richard sat with his handler, pale but practiced. Emily and Ryan arrived late. Ryan kept his jaw set, playing the wounded husband. The board sat on the stage, looking as if they'd been through a storm. I walked to the podium and didn't speak immediately. I let the silence stretch so it could pull attention to me, burning it into focus. When I finally spoke, it was slow and methodical. I described the deal, the audits, the numbers, the people. I spoke about the vendors who had been shortchanged, the contracts that had been mismanaged, and the fact that Carter Industries had been sold to an investor who intended to save jobs, not exile families. And then I did something no one expected. I apologized, not for the takeover, not for the restructuring, for the public spectacle that had hurt people who didn't deserve it. The employees, the vendors, and the innocence in my mother's name. I told the room that I had allowed humiliation to guide me, and that had gone too far. I offered to put a governance committee in place, to bring in independent auditors, to protect the workforce. The cameras zoomed in on Richard's face. It was a mask of disbelief. Emily's eyes found mine, and for a second there was something like relief there, as if the apology had given her moral permission to breathe. And then, as I stepped away from the podium, one of the reporters raised a question that landed like a new grenade. "Mr. Hayes, will you commit to a complete, independent investigation into Carter Industries' past contracts, including any that involved the Harrison family?" Ryan's jaw tightened. The room hummed. I looked at the cameras, the board, at Richard, then at Emily. My next move would define everything. I could square my shoulders, point fingers, and ignite a public war that would burn everything down. Or I could take the slow, patient path of repair. and lose the instant gratification of revenge, somewhere between the applause and the flashbulbs. I realized the thing I'd started to want wasn't just to hurt them anymore. It was to be better than the memory that had haunted me. It was to prove I could rise without dragging others into the dark with me. The choice hung in the air like a line waiting to be crossed. I had to choose, and whatever I chose would determine if this story became about me surviving, or about me becoming the man I'd feared. The week after the press conference moved faster than any week I'd lived before, and slower than any I wanted. Headlines rotated through the city like vultures. Opinion pieces argued about ethics and class, and whether a man who could buy a company was any better than the man he'd replaced. Comment threads called me names I'd heard in high school, but the facts were on my side, and facts, when laid out clean and relentless, have a way of cutting through noise. The independent investigation I'd promised wasn't a stunt. I hired a respected third-party firm with no ties to either side. They combed through contracts, emails, invoices, every digital footprint baby Richard and his inner circle had left. They brought in forensic accountants. They subpoenaed long-buried documents. It was exhaustive and surgical. When the first report landed on the board's table, it read like a slow collapse. There were kickbacks. There were side agreements that padded pockets and starved production lines. Vendors had been paid late for years, while a handful of executives enjoyed deferred bonuses tied to phantom performance. In the margin notes, the investigators wrote the kind of language that lands in criminal court. Conflicts of interest, deliberate misrepresentation of financials, concealment of liabilities. I didn't celebrate immediately. That kind of ruin doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels heavy, like a storm passing over a small town. Trees uprooted, roofs torn, but the town still standing. People I'd never met before called to say their jobs mattered to them. Employees who'd been too scared to speak up texted me with stories I held in my palm like glass. My stomach clenched reading them. This was what I'd wanted to fix all along. Not revenge for the sake of revenge, but correction. The board convened an emergency meeting. The vote was swift. Richard was asked to step down. He resigned with the kind of dignity carved out of paper, formal, fragile, the kind he'd always used to buy time. The press circled. Papers printed photos of him leaving, watching his smile crumble frame by frame. It was visceral and terrible, and I felt the satisfaction like a burn across my skin. Ryan's fall was slower but uglier. Once the investigations hit public channels, the Harrison family shifted. Calls I made to mutual contacts were returned with clipped tones. Ryan's investors and in-laws made polite statements about seeking stability, which in practice meant cutting the cord. He tried to salvage pride with harsh interviews, but no one wanted to be tied to the scandal. Ryan's confidence dissolved in real time. The man who'd stood at the altar to a higher status found himself alone in a house that suddenly seemed too big for one ego. Emily's unraveling was the most complicated thing. People love narratives with simple villains and neat punishments. Real life gives you grey. At first, her friends drifted away. Slow, socially acceptable excuses. The charity boards rescinded invitations. The gala season that had once sprawled in front of her like a red carpet closed like a book. She cried once in front of a neighbour and once in the driver's seat of a car at midnight. I saw the posts that tried to explain, the heartfelt statements with qualifiers about mistakes and learning. I read them and felt oddly hollow. I'd wanted her to feel the consequence, to understand what it meant to be cast down. But I hadn't wanted misery. A month after the report, the legal machinery turned its gears. Several executives faced regulatory fines. A few quietly negotiated settlements. Criminal referrals were made on some of the more egregious actions. Carter Industries, under a temporary governance committee I'd recommended, began the slow work of making amends, restructuring debt, honouring overdue vendor payments. instituting whistleblower protections. I insisted on a restitution fund for the workers who had been shorted. I pushed to create a community trust to fund retraining programs for employees displaced by the restructuring. It wasn't charity. It was responsibility. When the day came to sign the settlement agreements, Richard looked at me across the table like a man who had been reading the wrong translation of his life. There was a moment, bare and naked, where I saw the man who'd once bullied his way through boardrooms, who'd smiled over plates of caviar, and underneath that veneer was a tired man who'd traded decency for dominance and then misread the price. "You ruined us," he said, voice small. "No," I replied. "You did. I just turned on the lights." There was no scene of screaming revenge, no public meltdown where I threw his watch into a fountain. It was a contract signing, an exchange of legal language that would keep him out of a courtroom and pay back what he'd drained. It was less theatrical than the story everyone wanted, but cleaner. It was effective. In the months that followed, Ryan moved out of the old Harrison townhouse and into a smaller apartment with fewer chandeliers and less pretense. Emily sold the house she and Ryan had bought and stopped going to certain country clubs. She opened a small non-profit aimed at helping returning citizens find work, an oddly specific cause that made sense if you knew the way she'd been raised. Polished, philanthropic, performative. Now it had to be real. People asked if I felt better. Sometimes I did. Mostly I felt tired. The victory I'd imagined for so long was not sweet. It was complicated, like a dish with too many spices. I had what I wanted: control, dignity, a seat among people who once never noticed me. But the cost was higher than I'd expected. Then came the last act, small and private. One evening, months later, I ran into Emily at a community fundraiser where she was volunteering. Hair pulled back, hands in a flour-dusted apron as she arranged sandwiches on a table. She looked up when she heard my voice. "You came," she said, not a question. "I did," I replied. We stood in the hum of fluorescent lights and clinking plates, a room of people trying to rebuild in the wake of chaos. She met my gaze and didn't flinch. "I'm sorry," she said. "It wasn't theatrical. It was honest and raw, for the first time in years." She looked like the girl who had once stayed up late with me, studying for finals, not the woman who'd smirked at my humiliation. "I know," I said. I wanted to say more. I wanted to tell her how much she'd hurt me and how much I'd built. I wanted to say I forgave her and mean it. In that small, crowded room, speech felt both too small and too large. So I stayed quiet. Instead, I nodded toward the line where volunteers were packing care boxes. "You're doing good work," I said. She inhaled, a small breath of something like relief. "So are you," she said. We didn't embrace. We didn't trade life updates. We simply acknowledged each other and then returned to the night's work. It wasn't cinematic. It was enough. Weeks later, the city named a small program after the community trust we'd established. I attended the ribbon cutting, clapped when the mayor spoke, felt the press flash like a distant thunder. People wrote pieces that tried to box the story into tidy morals. Some called me a hero, others a villain with a clean suit. I stopped reading the comments. In the end, revenge had been a stepping stone, not a destination. I'd taken back what was mine, my dignity, my name, and I'd done it in a way that made a small bit of justice possible for people who deserved it more than I did. I didn't become the monster I feared. I wasn't the saint I never thought I could be. I was a man who had been insulted in front of 200 people, who'd chosen to fight back, and then, slowly, tried to keep his humanity intact while doing it. Sometimes, late at night, when the city lights were thin and steady, and the old echoes of laughter and cruelty drifted past my window, I would let myself smile, not because I'd won, but because I'd walked through the fire and came out with a life I could stand in. The world had shifted. So had I, and that, quiet and stubborn, was enough. The night air in Chicago was cool, the kind that carried the smell of rain, even when the streets were dry. I stood on the balcony of my apartment, looking out at the skyline that had once felt so far away from me. Carter Industries Tower was still lit, but the name on its crown had changed. No longer Richard Carter's. No longer a monument to arrogance. It was something different now, something rebuilt. Behind me, the television hummed with another news panel, dissecting the downfall of Richard Carter and his family. I muted it. I didn't need their analysis. I had lived it. For a moment, my mind flickered back to that wedding night. The tucks that felt too tight, the laughter that stung like acid, Emily's voice, sharp and cruel, calling me a fat pig, while her new husband smirked beside her. That night I was broken. Tonight I wasn't. My phone buzzed on the table. A message. Unknown number. I picked it up. Thank you for not destroying us completely. I stared at it for a long time, then set the phone down without replying. Some words didn't need answers. Some wounds didn't need reopening. I poured myself a drink, leaned against the balcony rail, and let the city noise wash over me. I had taken my revenge. I had torn down the walls of the Carter Empire brick by brick. But more importantly, I had built something out of the rubble, not just for myself, but for the people Richard had left behind. That was the difference between him and me. He took to feed his ego. I gave back to prove I was more than his insult. Somewhere across the city, Richard Carter was a ghost, in a mansion too large for one man. Ryan Harrison was nursing the emptiness of power lost. And Emily was trying to build a new life in the shadows of her old one. As for me, I wasn't their victim anymore. I wasn't their punchline. I wasn't their pig. I was the man who had looked humiliation in the eye, burned it down, and walked away with my dignity intact. And for the first time in years, as I lifted the glass to my lips, I felt something that had been missing since that night.